Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you today.
Thank you, Dr. Paul.
Daniel, we had a couple things going on in Washington, and since you're a Washington expert and know how the system works, there were two events. One, there was a vote on the floor dealing with foreign policy and bringing the troops home, and our friends offered that, Jim McGovern and Walter Jones and others. They were trying to say, get the troops home. The other was there was a hearing held with Ashton Carter along with John Dempsey, and they're talking about they're not getting enough troops to fight the war over there. But tell us a little bit about this HCON Res 55 that was an attempt to try to slow this war down a bit.
Yeah, and this is a move that was made many times back when you were in office as well, when the various deployments of troops took place. And I think Dennis Kucinich did this in the past as well. And this is to use a provision of the War Powers Resolution, which, you know, I know you're not a fan of. It's obviously an unconstitutional bill, but it does provide a mechanism for Congress to check a president who sends troops away without a declaration. And essentially it's Section 5C, and I can read it quickly if anyone's interested, because anytime the U.S. Armed Forces are engaged in hostilities outside the territory of the U.S., its possessions and territories, without a declaration of war or specific statutory authorization, such forces will be removed by the President if the Congress so directs by a concurrent resolution. And so that's exactly what Representative McGovern, along with Walter Jones and Barbara Lee, attempted to do with HCON Res 55.
Now, I understand the vote didn't go all that well.
No, it was 139 yeses and 288 noes.
Yeah, but there were some of those votes we did back in the old days, and we'd get 10 or 15, so maybe this is progress. But this sort of coincides with what they tried last week as well, didn't we? They also have a vote on a resolution last week, or an amendment.
Yeah, Adam Schiff offered an amendment, which was more liberal in a sense, in that it gave the president, I think, until the middle of next year to pull the troops out unless he got an authorization or declaration.
Well, I think also it was just at least permitting a debate on the issue, and the Congress wouldn't even allow it to happen. But, you know, the War Powers Resolution is one thing, but, you know, if we had more constitutionalists there and more anti-war people, we wouldn't have to deal with this complex resolution, which really nobody ever follows. They could, you know, think about following the Constitution.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, wait for a declaration, but they still, even if the president goes ahead, the Congress can stop that anytime they want. They say, no money, no money.
Do you remember when President Obama sent over, I think, some text for an authorization, wasn't? And he said, I don't really care either way, but if you want to look at this, go ahead.
Well, he's had a habit of saying, well, if you don't do this, I'll write an executive order on some environmental things and some domestic affairs. And unfortunately, they can get away with this. But, you know, the other issue was Ashton Carter and Dempsey talking before a committee, and they were pretty blunt about why aren't things going well. You know, they wanted to have, I think, in a month or two, have a total of 24,000 ready-to-go troops, Iraqi troops, to finally do something with ISIS, and they're frustrated. So far, they've only had 7,000 recruits. So that's an issue going on. But it was a surprise that they can't find people. Do you have a suspicion on what's going on there?
Yeah, he admitted before the House Armed Services Committee that we're not able to recruit Iraqis to fight against ISIS in Iraq. And here's a great quote. I was going to ask you a question about this. So on one hand, they can't find people there that will fight this battle.
All right.
Yet on the other hand, Carter said, putting U.S. combat troops on the ground as a substitute for local forces will not produce enduring results. We know that already from the 2003 invasion. So what is the option then?
Well, you know, I think they only have two options. You know, if they won't fight, and there's quite a few reasons for that, and they want to win the war, the neocons have a simple solution, and you hear it every day. Send American troops. We can't win without troops, and we got to send them in. But there is another option. Since they're at an impasse, they would have to consider our argument. Well, if it's not going well, why don't we leave? But that's a sense of surrender, and I've run into this over many years, that if you're surrendering, I remember so clearly how Huckabee, pointed out, you mean if you just leave, that means everybody who had died in vain. So how many more do you want to kill that will die in vain? But, I've had some personal, thoughts about this because I was in the military in the 60s, and I can remember very clearly being on active duty, leaving active duty in 65, and people were getting very frustrated, but not nearly as much as the end of the 60s. But I remember so well hearing the message of McNamara coming on, well, it looks like we need, 200,000, 300,000, 500,000 troops to win this war, and they were beefing it up. And then, of course, it didn't go well, and then they always said, we're going to win, win, win. And then in 68, the American people said, we've had enough of this. We need another party. And so Nixon became the peace candidate. Sort of reminds me a little bit about what's going on now. We get rid of the Bush administration, and we have a new president who sort of lends himself to saying, well, maybe let's stop these wars, and yet they're still escalated. But then Nixon gets elected, and still 30,000 men and women got killed. So I just don't understand why people can't accept the idea that there is a different policy, and it's not a tactical policy. I think it has to be strategic.
It's interesting that you bring up what Nixon did, because I wrote a little piece for the Institute's website kind of making fun of Jeb Bush's announcement. And, his big criticism of the Obama administration is they're not acting like peacemakers. So it's almost he's taking a page from Nixon's book.
Well, they can't, they're very frustrated. They can't get the recruits. Maybe they don't want to fight. When they get in a fight, they leave. But there's one group that doesn't seem to leave. They end up with token victories, and they do quite well, and they don't need inspiration from it. Those are the Kurds. What do you think's going on there? Why do you think the Kurds might be doing better than us recruiting Sunnis to fight Sunnis, And
another reason why they won't be fighting for Baghdad. They're fighting for their homeland, or for what they believe will be a future legal homeland for them. And that gives you all the motivation, as we would all have in the U.S.
And in many ways, this is clear evidence. What these leaders are telling us is that Abadi is not really the president of Iraq. It seems like we're desperately clinging to the intervention in 1918, the Versailles Treaty.
Yeah.
The West divided that area up now, and it looks like they won't give up on it. So I would suggest, which I've done for many, many years now, and there's more people thinking about it, is just back away and let them have three different countries. But when the other side suggests that, what they say? We'll draw the lines of the three countries.
Well, the whole issue is it's like a repeat of Yugoslavia. The U.S. and interventionism creates hypersectarianism where there was not that in the past. And once you have hypersectarianism, you won't find Shia groups willing to fight in Sunni areas, and Sunnis in Sunni areas will not fight against ISIS. So you create the problem of hypersectarianism, and then you say, what are we going to do now? These people won't fight for each other. We have this problem of hypersectarianism.
The politics of this is interesting. Not too many people were happy with George W. Bush in 2008, and I think that was the year we lost the House and the Senate and the presidency, because people were sick and tired of it. So somebody comes in who's more pro-peace and sick and tired of the war president. But it's been the other way. Nixon was elected as a different party, against, the Democrats in the 60s. But so if this is the case right now, Obama and the Democrats are seen as the war party, but it doesn't seem like there's any answer coming from the Republicans. Instead of them saying, he's made a mess of things and what we need to do is back off or something, they're taking a more militant stand. It means that the American people have less and less choices. Yeah, I have always worked on the theory that if the people know the truth and understand what's going on, they are going to vote for the peace candidate.
Yeah, it almost makes an argument not to vote. But if I can bring up one other thing about Ashton Carter's appearance that I thought was interesting, and we talked about this a little earlier. The other thing he complained about is in Syria, they're not able to get enough people to fight on the U.S. side, which is against ISIS, but most importantly to overthrow Assad. And he said the problem there is that we have a lack of a legitimate government partner, even though Assad has been fighting ISIS all along. But you know, this reminds me of what you always say too. They use these little lies to justify getting a foot in the door for war, which then expands and nobody remembers how they started. But if you remember in 2011, what we were sold, why we had to go in Syria, was because the people were rising up democratically against a dictator, and they were all there, they were ready to take it over. They just needed a little help and a little support from the U.S. So now they're telling us that we've got to recruit people from outside the country to come in and fight because no one in the country is willing to fight this fight. It's just like in Iraq when they said, we've got to save this little group of Yazidis, so we're going to have a very limited strike. Nobody will even notice it. And here we are a year later.
But the irony is they never recognize and will admit failure. So, yes, who was helped the most by us going into Syria? ISIS, and they still help, and they end up with our weapons, and they end up with our money, they end up with the oil. You remember, the oil was supposed to help pay for the war and all this sort of thing, but they never back off. It's somewhat like the Federal Reserve. No matter what kind of problem they have, because they print too much money, they print more and more and spend more and run up the debt. In foreign policy, they do the same thing. The policies are failing, and here they are now. The military people are questioning this, the wisdom of it, and they know the American people don't want to troops on the ground, but they also know there's no victory in this. And in that sense, the neocons are right. Yeah. You're not going to win this way. But what are you going to win, and will you really win? In the 60s, they kowtowed to the warmongers and sent in 500,000 troops. We lost 60,000 troops being killed over there. And who would have ever predicted that when we surrendered, when we left, that peace finally came, and guess what? We finally won over many of the Vietnamese who are now allies and partners, and we do business with them. And I've always said, you win a lot more in peace than you do in war, but how in the world are we going to wake up the people? Now, there's one thing that I think that is important, is how do you motivate people? People are concerned in writing articles about, oh, there's young people now are motivated to join ISIS, and why do they do this, and why do they do this? And of course, young people are motivated. They want to believe in principle, and they're you know, they look at this and see some injustices and they join. But young people, you know, join the most militant groups when you think about communism and the Nazis. But I'm also convinced that young people in this country are attracted to the principles of liberty, and they can be mobilized. But if we're silent or we don't get our message out, the demagogues and the neocons and the conventional media and the military-industrial complex, they will grab hold of the young people. And of course, the bottom line is the worst part of the consequence of this, and this is the loss of liberty, and that is a problem. But I am convinced we have to continue to convince the young people and anybody who will listen that it's time to change policy. Intervention doesn't work, and this is not a tactical problem that we have, a management problem. Well, let's change generals or something like that. I think we have to change the strategy. We have to change our philosophy, and you won't believe it, but I'm voting for non-intervention, for bringing the troops home, and never going to war unless the people in this country agreed to it. That is what I believe we need. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.